Hey, it's Joshua Zeller, your cultural Catholic, coming at you with episode 3 in my mini-series on the history of colonial India, focusing mainly on the military history of India. And today we're going to talk about the changes that occurred after the Indian Rebellion of 1857-58. So, a little recap. Last episode, we talked about the Indian Rebellion of 1857-58. The vast majority of the Indian Army, British Indian Army, rose up against their British overlords, did a lot of crazy stuff, and they ended up having to do a lot of changes to the army because of the localities of where the majority of the rebels came from, and so that meant that they had to do a lot of rethinking on how they built their armies in India, and that led to a shift in where they did most of their recruiting. All right, now to get into the thick of it. So there are two main groups within the British Indian Army: the Sahib and the Sepoy. The Sahib were the British officers, the white men who were in charge of the Indian Army, the troops on the ground level. These men were required to do a couple of things before they were able to take command of their troops. And that was to first learn the language Urdu, which because of where the majority of troops were recruited from, basically became the lingua franca of the entire British Indian Army. And Urdu is spoken primarily in Pakistan today, so vast majority of these soldiers came from what is now Pakistan. Now, they also, depending on what soldier that they were, what ethnic group that they were assigned to, they also had to learn Pashto, Nepali, and Punjabi, among many other languages. And these were important languages to a lot of regions that they recruited from. Nepali, obviously Nepal, and the Gurkhas, even though they technically aren't from India, were part of the British Indian Army. Pashto comes from what is now Afghanistan, and that may seem a little strange, but a lot of Afghan tribes were recruited from. Uh, and Punjabi is obviously on the border area of Pakistan and India today, and that is also where a lot of recruiting occurred. And it was also the last region that was conquered by the British East India Trading Company, and obviously the British Crown, and so there was a heavy focus on recruiting from that particular region as well. Um, so these men typically came from the Sandhurst Military Academy, and they were typically near the top of their classes, meaning that they could have chosen to serve anywhere. And this is the junior officers, so lieutenants, captains, majors sometimes. And they literally could have chosen to serve anywhere, but they chose to go to India because of the opportunities that were presented there for advancement and glory. There was a lot of fighting between the British Indian government and the Pashto tribes and the other Afghan tribes, which kind of caused a few issues with some of their soldiers, seeing as some would come from Pashto tribes. But it was. We'll get a little bit more into this in a little bit when we start focusing on the Sepoys themselves. But otherwise, there was also this view of defending the crown jewel of the British Empire because India was so valuable, and right between with Afghanistan right in between, Russia and British India were very close to each other, and many theorized that if the Russians were to try to knock the British down in prestige, they would go for India, and it'd just be a skip through Afghanistan right into India, and from their Central Asian territories, and so that was also a very big draw for a lot of cadets. Now, even though they were trained to be culturally sensitive to their soldiers, they were, for instance, giving training on how to respect Sikh soldiers as opposed to Muslim soldiers or the very rare Hindu soldier. They still viewed themselves as culturally and racially superior, um, and that was just typical cultural understanding at the time because they were white men. They were supposed to be superior, and that was something that, even though they did have some sort of admiration for their men, it was more like uh, a father to a child, in that the relationship between a father and child is the father is superior to the child. And of course, there is a need for superiority when you're an officer leading men, but it was a little bit more patronizing than professional in some aspects. Um, but they did also kind of have this like Christian belief that they were the father figure guiding these men, and there's a little bit of cultural two-way with that. That is the Sahib or the British officers. Now onto the Sepoys. The Sepoys were drawn from a very disparate groups of people. Now, a big thing on this was that after the war, they created this martial race theory, in that certain groups had martial qualities and others did not. So, for instance, the Bengali were viewed as effeminate and too educated, whereas the people of the Punjab or Nepal were much more rugged, and were much more suited to fighting. Of course, there were racist theories behind that, and a good portion of that is that peoples from these regions were not as educated. Education was not always on the same level throughout the entirety of India, and those that they originally recruited from, particularly the south central regions, were much more educated than in the northwestern regions. So this was a very important thing for the British to ultimately control the soldiers that they had. And now to get a little bit more into the groups that again were artificially constructed by the British to an extent. So one of the major groups they recruited from were the people from Nepal, and they were put into Gurkha regiments. And these people were from a very mountainous region, and it was viewed similar to the Scottish Highlanders. A book that I've been talking about a little bit, Heather Street's Martial Race Theory, that draws a connection between the Highlanders and certain Indian groups, because of the rugged terrain that exists kind of in the Punjabi region, in Nepal, and in the Scottish Highlands. They kind of drew this connection that rugged territory makes rugged men, and rugged men are the best for fighting, and that kind of drew a connotation. And actually, the people of Nepal fought a war against the British, as I mentioned in the first video, and so that kind of drew some respect for the British towards the people of Nepal, similar to how the British had some respect, of course, after perception changed in the 18th century towards the Highlanders, because the Highlanders were known to have resisted the British rule or English rule. Another group of peoples that were heavily recruited were the peoples of the Punjab. Some of these people were Sikhs. Sikhs are a religious group that came about in the 17th century, and part of the reason that Sikhs were um, uh, heavily recruited was this Khalsa warrior community that was created by their last human guru. Um, and to be a part of this group, you would have to be a consummate warrior. You'd have to be very uh, uh, again, you have to be a warrior would have to follow certain rules, and that was very appealing to the British. Another group were, of course, the Punjabi Muslims, who we would now know as the Pakistanis. They, of course, were either converts to Islam or descendants of the Mughals. And Mughals were the I forget which language, but Indian language version of the word Mongol. So they were descendants of the Mongol invaders from long ago. So there was that connection there, and of course they're from a very rugged region, so they were considered very rugged men, very attuned towards war. And other groups were the Dogras and the Rajputs. Dogras were a grouping of hill tribes, and again, hill regions, rugged terrain. There's a lot of circular logic when it comes to this. However, the Rajputs were chosen because there was a bit of military tradition instilled in them. They came from, again, a mountainous region, but it was where a lot of Afghan tribes would come in for raids, and of course, to protect yourself from raids, you have to be warriors and fight. So there's a little bit of logic there. However, there's another group that is slightly taken up by Jats and Punjabi Muslims, and that is another group that's taken up by Sikhs and Punjabi Muslims, and that is the Jat ethnic group. Jats were considered very loyal, very disciplined, and very courageous. Again, also they came from a very mountainous or hilly region, and again that logic of rugged terrain, rugged man, great at warfare. And then there were the Pathans. Pathans are a Pashto-speaking ethnic group, and obviously that could cause some issues because a Pathan Sepoy could be fighting a Pathan tribesman who was their brother in one of the border skirmishes between the Afghan tribes and the British Indian Army. But there was also a tradition of Pathans fighting in Mughal armies. So there, again, is a little bit of actual connection between reality and the martial race theory. But again, it was a very racist theory, not an actual accurate description of reality. And again, the idea was to pick people who were considered a hardy race, and were from a very rugged regions. And Victorian era thought was that peoples from Western and peoples of the West and South were unfit for military service, and were considered soft, whereas those who were from peasant stock or the frontiers were perceived more hardy and perceived to have military traditions. But again, they were from rural communities, meaning they were likely to be uneducated, and those who are more educated tend to be more politically minded, and they did not want their soldiers wanting to be independent, ultimately, from the British Empire, and so they wanted more loyal soldiers. And another reason to recruit from different groups is that if, say, Sikhs decided to rebel, they'd still have Gurkhas, Punjabi Muslims, Pathans, Rajputs, Dogras to crush the Sikhs, and so on and so forth. So it was a divide and conquer strategy that they used in England, in Africa, only slightly adjusted for their military service. It was, to be honest, a brilliant strategy, however racist or horrible it was, and it worked out for quite a long time. Of course, World War One kind of started a change to this, and we will discuss that in our next episode, which will not be next week, but in 2 weeks. Next week, I'm going to take a little break from this and go with another topic. But if you like over here, you can check out the other two videos that I've produced for this. You can subscribe over here, and you can check out my other channels up there. This is Josh Rizal, your Cultural Catholic, signing off.